Welcome to the JFW podcast, where we talk about everything health related from a bioenergetic or metabolic perspective. I'm Jay Feldman of jayfeldmanwellness.com, and joining me again today is my good friend Mike Fave. Mike is a really knowledgeable guy, and he and I share a lot of similar health perspectives. Today we're going to be talking about a few topics. We're going to talk about undereating. We're going to talk about vegetables and our microbiome, genetics, a little bit of evolution. And then later on, we're going to be getting into a couple of Q&As about non-alcoholic fatty liver disease, brain function, testosterone. We'll see what we get to. But yeah, let's dive right in. So last episode, we talked quite a bit about how in the earlier parts of our health journeys, we were undereating, where part of it was just because we wanted to be lean and it was intentional, where, and this is still really common, where just the idea that eating less and again, exercising more is healthy and favoring low calorie foods instead of high calorie foods. And whether it's intentional or not, a lot of us don't even realize how ingrained this is in our minds and how much it affects kind of like all of our choices, where we really ignore our innate hunger signals and our innate drive to eat, and instead are kind of always restricting ourselves. And at every meal, we're kind of purposely thinking about how much we're eating and trying not to eat too much. And that's just kind of like the very general paradigm that a lot of people live by. And Mike and I both, spoke last episode to how we fell into this. And one of the biggest differences I know for me, and I'm sure the same for you, Mike, was when we did find this kind of alternative perspective, looking at things in terms of energy and metabolism. We recognized really how much of a disservice we were doing to our own physiology, where, eating enough food is really essential to producing energy. We need to be consuming the nutrients, and nutrients meaning both vitamins and minerals and
the macros,
right? And the macronutrients like carbs, fat, and protein that contribute to calories. So simply just eating enough is entirely necessary in order to be producing enough energy. And our hunger is really a really great tool for determining how much we need to be eating, and it's also a sign of what our body needs. So if we're walking around hungry all the time, we essentially know that we're walking around energy deficient. And I know for me, when I started eating more, and we really started eating a lot more. So I think for me, it was going from about 2,600 calories a day to 3,500, even up to 4,500 calories a day. I think at our peak, and then kind of worked our way back down after we had that refeeding period.
I'm still at 35. Still at 35.
Yeah, about 3,500. But I was saying up to 4,500, kind of around the max, maybe even 5,000 a couple of days.
With all the 8 plantains.
Yeah, and that really made I think that probably made the biggest difference for me, both like physically in the way that it made me feel, and then also mentally in kind of it was just so freeing, in having been weighed down by hunger and restriction for my whole life. Like, it was, without even thinking about it, I was always trying to eat less. And when I was thinking about it, I was definitely trying to eat less.
I think there's a difference though, because a lot of people get to a point where they try to eat less and they're just not hungry anymore at all. Whereas you still had your hunger, and I know I still had my hunger, but I think at a certain point, a lot of people just aren't even hungry, like
That's
after like periods of time.
Yeah, I mean,
both are obviously a problem.
Right. And we were pretty young. So, when we were doing this, so it's not as much of a surprise that our hunger was still there. Whereas, if over time, if your metabolism really reduces that much and you just don't have that hunger anymore. But even for me, I mean, I remember I had mentioned where when I had first kind of increased to like a 2,000 calorie a day diet, and I was so full on that diet, I was entirely full, maybe I was still hungry. Maybe the hunger signals were there, but I was just physically full.
I think this goes hand in hand with what we're going to talk about in regards to like vegetables and things like that.
Yeah, absolutely. We'll get to that in a second. But yeah, kind of. So one thing maybe it's important to differentiate between the difference of like the psychological hunger which you shouldn't even say psychological, but just the difference of the feeling of hunger and the feeling of being full or empty kind of in your gut.
Yeah.
Where hunger is more of a signal from your brain, although your liver, it's affected by liver stores and things like that as well.
Mm-hmm.
But it's basically hunger is basically a signal of whether or not you have enough energy. It's directly ATP dependent. There's some interesting studies showing that, but then you also have fullness, which is more of an indicator of how your digestion is and whether or not kind of you have a lot of food in your gut and whether or not it's being digested properly. So you can be full,
or if it's irritating the gut or whatnot.
Yeah, especially that. So bloating will cause you to feel full, or anything that's irritating the gut, or anything.
It'll take away your hunger.
It can.
For me, if I get super bloated, I tend to move towards not wanting to eat anything.
Well, you might not. So there's kind of for a lot of people, you have this competing feeling where you have this bloating fullness, but you also have these signals that are saying, I still need food.
Yeah, the cravings.
Yeah.
I think the cravings are even worse than the actual hunger.
Sure. Yeah. I guess I was kind of equating those two. But yeah, so you can have both of those at the same time. And I think that's how most people live their lives, is they're mostly full. And then, especially and we can kind of talk about the vegetables now, but when you're eating a lot of salads, let's say, or a lot of raw vegetables and, some protein, then you're going to be feeling really full, but you're essentially still going to be starving because you're not going to be supplying enough of the substrates from which our bodies produce energy.
Or energy metabolism.
Right. Yeah. Do you want
I think it's interesting to bring up what is people's number one, what are their number one cravings? What do they actually crave for? And I think most people, it's generally sugar. Yeah. It's generally candy or something sweet. And then for a lot of women, particularly around the time of the month, you have the saturated fatty acid foods like ice cream and chocolate and sugar and salt.
I was going to say.
The basic, people either crave potato chips or chocolate or ice cream or candy or things like that. You never hear anybody say, damn, I really want some broccoli.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. Or donuts or whatever it is, all the things that people have trouble saying no to, or when it's sitting in front of them, they're always going to,
energy dense foods.
Yeah. And
that's definitely for a reason.
Right. And then we blame that. We blame all those foods on our lack of health or our gaining weight. And that we're not saying that those are the ideal foods.
Don't. It's just it's not that you crave the donut, it's that you crave the substrates present within the donut, and marketing or human ingenuity has allowed us to package everything very, very nicely within the donut.
Right.
So all your cravings are met right there. And it's yeah, I want this donut.
Right. Yeah. The hyperpalatability that's always talked about, but the hyperpalatability isn't the issue. It's not. The issue isn't that we crave sugar or that we crave fat or that we crave salt. All of those things are necessary for us, and that's why we crave them. And this kind of, again, goes along with this whole idea of fighting against our bodies versus working with them, and understanding that
willpower.
Yeah, right. Fighting, and that's what
that's yourself how, through it.
Yeah, and you and I both have done that, where we've willed ourselves to not eat certain foods or to not eat enough food, or both most of the time. Mm-hmm. Really fighting against our bodies rather than recognizing that our bodies don't want us to be unhealthy. These innate drives for sugar and salt and saturated fat are there because those are they're extremely important and things that most people are essentially deficient in.
Yeah. Well, I think a lot of people they tend to look at macros as separate from other nutrients. And in the beginning of the podcast, you talk about macros as being the same as other nutrients. And I think that's important for people to understand that you need enough fat, you need enough sugar, you need enough protein. It's not people play with their macro percentages a lot. I mean, not necessarily the general population, but more of the bodybuilders or, the more hardcore people, or if you get a diet from somewhere, it's the low fat diet or the low carb diet or the high protein diet, whatever people do. And they play with the macro percentages and they play around with the macros. And there's this idea that there's if you get these magical effects from one area, and you tend to get effects, low carb, low fat, whatever it is. Mm-hmm. But at the end of the day, you need you need a specific amount of each nutrient. Like there's a threshold where it is adequate and where it is necessary for you to have that much just to function optimally. So the goal is never to just drop one macro entirely, lose whatever weight you're going to lose, and then just keep trudging along. The goal is to figure out, well, how much of this do I actually need? Like how much of the B vitamin or how much vitamin D or things like that. And then to optimize for that. And the body itself will function to an extent where you're not going to see this massive weight gain. You're not going to see this, these like degenerative processes going on, or whatever you have going on, whatever winds up happening. It's like, let's find the optimum level. And the other thing to say is it's not necessarily, there's an amount of the macro, but I think where it comes from is also important. I mean, the example with the donut, you crave the sugar and the fat and the salt and whatever else is in the donut. I don't think getting it from a donut is the right way to go. However, it doesn't mean that your cravings are wrong. It's just that there's a place to get these things from, and you're probably not going to get cravings once you go there. I know for both you and I, when we were doing all the willpower stuff, we had cravings for sure. Like that was the number one thing, is like, well, we don't really have any health problems per se, but like we're constantly thinking about food and constantly having cravings for particular things. For us, it was 5-pound bag of blueberries, which, is different than your donut, but still there's I think that there's merit to the craving from your body in sort of a matter where it comes from. And there's also value to each macronutrient as a nutrient in and of itself, not as just something that you can toss to the side. I think a lot of people get lost in this sort of dogma.
Yeah. You made a few really good points there that I want to expand upon a little bit. So one was, so the idea that people don't consider sugar or fat as essential or as kind of nutrients. Mm-hmm. And we were definitely in that camp, especially when we were kind of in those paleo days, and we were,
oh yeah,
it was all about getting enough vitamins and minerals and just filling up on tons of vegetables. And you don't even consider, again, and recognizing the importance of metabolism and energy production was really the difference here, because then you realize, well, you can't produce energy from just vitamins and minerals. You need to have a substrate, and most of the diets out there,
oil, no gas in the car.
Right. Yeah, just you have everything else.
The car is fully loaded. You have your C63 Mercedes-Benz, but you have no gas for it.
Right. Yeah, exactly. That's exactly what it was. And it's, and we had this idea that the gas was the bad part, which obviously it wasn't. But yeah, so I think that that's a really important kind of paradigm shift. And then again, I wanted to clarify that, again, we're not necessarily just talking about saturated fat or sugar or salt in any foods that those are in. We're not saying that donuts and cookies are, that we should be gorging ourselves on those, but if we have a nutrient dense diet, which includes enough sugar and enough saturated fat, then we won't have those cravings anymore. And people talk about not having cravings on like a ketogenic or high fat diet. And you and I definitely never experienced that. And I was actually doing a ketogenic diet.
I wasn't.
Yeah. But even so, I mean,
oh yeah, I was still craving super hard.
Yeah, intense cravings for carbohydrates. And we would eat the blueberries or coconut flour cookies to try to quench them, but it didn't. We still
we would just wind up binging. We literally binged. We were still
hungry. We would end up being full and hungry that same.
Well, those coconut cookies was like eating cement.
But exactly, we were full, but it was like we still wanted to eat.
Still wanted it. Yeah. I remember feeling terrible after we did that. After we did the coconut flours, like, well, there's not that much carbs with the coconut flour, so then we can use the sugar. And that was a terrible experience.
Yeah,
just so much fiber, and you just wanted to keep eating.
Right. Yeah. Exactly. And it was such a. I mean, it's hard to articulate the difference that it makes of not having those feelings, those cravings anymore. Like. Yeah. And because that was the perfect example of it, where we would eat, I don't know, a dozen or more of these really dense coconut flour cookies that made us feel so full, but the cravings were still
mostly fiber.
Yeah, they were mostly fiber.
We were literally eating fiber.
Yeah, and we were eating a lot of vegetables and things like that. That also, which we're going to talk about vegetables in a second, that also had this kind of filling effect. And and yet you still had those cravings and hunger. And then when we kind of switched our diet around and began to eat more sugar in the form of orange juice or other fruit, we didn't have those same cravings, and it was a world of difference. I mean,
the carb cravings completely dissipated.
Yeah, and the obsession with food kind of dissipated too, what you mentioned, and it reminded me of
it was more like it changed courses, I would say, because it became more like, I know when I'm out of energy. Like, you sensed when your body was out of energy, and it wasn't like a craving now. Because I think it's helpful for people to see, you're still always going to be having, like, food is always going to be a central part. But it's not like we're dying for cravings. It's like, my blood sugar's starting to get a little bit lower. And it's like, this is like, I ate my last meal like three hours ago. It's like, I'm starting to, like, you can feel the shift over. Like, I'm starting to, like, run out of the fuel from the last meal. And then you're like, okay, I'm going to have some juice. And then you, like, relax.
And, and then once you eat it, then you feel good. Like, you don't, the craving goes away. That's the biggest difference is.
Yeah. And it's not even a craving really. It's just like,
right.
It's literally, I'm out of energy. It's like, I need more energy.
Yeah.
It's literally what it is. That's it.
Definitely. And it was a big hurdle to get over, of allowing ourselves to eat that much in general, to eat that much, or to, drink that much juice, or I think we were doing some jam and things at the time, or dried fruit. And it was definitely
a lot of dried mango.
Yeah. Which didn't necessarily go too well, but it definitely it was definitely like we reached that point of satisfaction for sure.
Yeah.
And it was a hurdle to get over feeling like, to get over the idea that you could eat that much, especially that much sugar, and that it wasn't bad for us. But then once we did it, it's such a world of difference. And as far as the food obsession goes, did you want to say something? Because I was going to.
Well, before we detail, I think it's important to see that a lot of people hold, like, a particular belief about a macronutrient or some component. Like, vegans think that protein is bad and animal fats are bad. And paleo thinks that or paleo keto thinks that sugar is bad for you. And it's like, both groups are, like, living.
And there's also the low fat crowd too.
Yeah. And the low fat crowd, which thinks that, you can't have too much fat. It shuts down glucose oxidation, and then it causes cancer. So you, like, have all these groups running on these different programs, and they're all, like, saying that one is going to get this disease and the other is going to get this disease. And so far, none of them have really gotten any of these major diseases, and each one has their issue. Each group has their problem. Whether you're on the vegan diet and it's like, my libido's gone, I'm cold all the time, and I can't build muscle, or you're on the keto diet and it's just like, I have these intense carb cravings, and my thyroid panel's not looking good. Or you're on the low fat diet and it's like, wow, I'm really constipated. Like, each diet has everyone's looking for this sort of magical formula by excluding one thing and then attaching it as an identity. And I think for us, like, when we went to eating all that sugar after being on fat for a while, it was like, this is not right. Like, there's not an issue with sugar. And then you eventually, like, figure out the nuances about it. I mean, and I think that's where we eventually came. And obviously Pete helped out a lot, because he gave, like, a sort of like a central theory or a hypothesis linking all the different aspects. But yeah, you sort of come to, again, that place where it's like, each macronutrient has its place and has different effects, and you can use them for the different effects that they have. And it's a matter of, like, sort of tailoring it to yourself. And then there's some principles that you can apply in there that make it very helpful. But I think seeing everything as the nutrients and the vitamins and the macros and whatnot as necessary, and using them, following course, using them as necessary.
Yeah. Well, and because you touched on it, why don't we talk a little bit about kind of, I don't know, your perspective on the roles of the different macronutrients?
I guess, I mean, my perspective is, some of it's based on research, some of it's hypothesis, and all of it is personal experience. So I just want to, like, stipulate with that first, because this is not the be all to end all statement. I guess we could start with protein, because right now that's everybody's favorite macronutrient. The protein in general, I would say we just use for liver health, for supplying enough amino acids to maintain your musculature. You basically want to get enough protein to maintain your lean mass That's organs, muscles, connective tissue and whatnot. You want to get all the essential amino acids. Yeah, bones as well. But you don't want to get so much so that you have to oxidize the protein for energy. And the reason for this is just because of the oxidation of protein generates ammonia. Ammonia is not necessarily a good thing. I mean, it's converted into urea, and urea does have beneficial effects, but it's just more efficient to either oxidize sugar and have enough sugar.
Well, and the conversion of amino acids to sugar requires a shift in hormones. It requires stress hormones, essentially.
Yeah, exactly. You require cortisol to undergo gluconeogenesis.
Or at the very least, you need at the very least low insulin, higher glucagon, higher and then adrenaline and cortisol come later. The cortisol is typically when you're pulling the amino acids from your tissues.
Mm-hmm.
You'll get gluconeogenesis just from high glucagon. But even high glucagon glucagon is a stress hormone, and high glucagon is like a primary feature of insulin resistance and diabetes. People typically look to the high insulin as the issue, but it's really high glucagon, and then the high insulin is kind of secondary. But anyways, carry on.
Yeah. Then the next, I guess that's pretty much like pretty basic for protein. I mean, protein does have a bunch of other beneficial effects. It helps the liver in detoxification of estrogen and different compounds by upregulating the P450 enzyme systems. And then it just has, it's a satiating macronutrient, especially if you go overboard on it.
And that's not a good thing, really.
No, that's not necessarily a good thing, but it's also, from some of the studies I've seen, it's very hard to put on body fat with protein. And a lot of people, I wouldn't say it's impossible, but a lot of, in the absence of carbs and enough carbs and enough fat, you can eat enough protein to maintain your lean mass and still have basic function. But after a certain percentage in the macronutrients, I think it's like 35 or 40%, it starts to actually become toxic to you. So, and some of the longevity studies that I've seen seem to cap protein at around 20%. 15 to 20% seems to be the ideal amount as a percentage of calories in the diet. If we're going to go to the next macronutrient, I think we should go to carbs. Because protein and carbs are generally the most well studied. Fat is only becoming in trend now that they have the ketogenic diets and all that. Atkins started, I think, that in the 80s and 90s, and now you have the keto and all that. It's become a bigger thing. But for carbs, I think carbs are very important for nervous system function and turning off the hypothalamus pituitary axis. So basically, stress hormones. Your blood sugar is literally one of the most important things in your body in terms of regulating stress. If your blood sugars drops between particular parameters, you basically have to liberate sugar and whatever else from your stores to be able to bring it back up, because the nervous system requires it to function. It doesn't really use fats as much. It can use ketones, but it still requires sugar.
Let's talk about that for a second, because we didn't talk about blood sugar last time. So essentially our brains and the rest of our nervous systems require glucose when they don't have ketones, which
but even when they have ketones, I'm pretty sure they still require X amount.
50%. Yeah, it's typically about 50-50. But the thing is, if you're producing ketones, it already requires your body to be under stress. Like, you're not producing
unless
ketones.
You're eating a lot of MCT oil.
Right. Well, and that's separate. So exogenous ketones or MCT oil, that's kind of like a separate process, which is fine. But the essentially ketone production is starvation, and it only happens when we don't have sugar available. And the reason for that, as you mentioned, is that sugar is so important for our brains and nervous system. It's really the preferred fuel. Again, ketones.
There's this argument that sugar is not important because we can survive without it. And I think that's sort of it's almost like a logical fallacy. I think it's more correct, at least in my opinion, to say that sugar is so vital that when we don't have it, we actually break down our own muscle tissue or whatever amino acids we have free. We sacrifice them to create sugar. And not only do we create a metabolic toxin, ammonia, from the process of sugar, we're or not only that we're breaking down muscle tissue, we are producing ammonia to get sugar. It's like so vitally important.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
I think that not relying on those backup pathways is definitely a good idea.
Yeah, it's really a very poor argument to say that we can survive without sugar. Also you can survive entirely without fat, especially if you're considering that the essential fatty acids aren't really essential. But even if you do think the essential fatty acids are essential, you only need to have like 0.3% of your diet as fat. So you can essentially live without fat too. Like,
I think some of the newer numbers are even less than that.
Okay. And I don't think that there's solid evidence that they are essential. I think there's good evidence against that. But
the number just keeps getting lower and lower.
Yeah. Yeah. But
it just goes lower every time.
Right. And I know we haven't talked about the importance of fats yet, but you could kind of say the same thing where if you don't eat enough fats, yes, you can produce them from carbohydrates and you will, but it's like you end up using your prized energy source to produce fats. That's how important they are.
Not an efficient process, I don't think, for a lot of people.
It's not. It's not. And people, man, there's so many fallacies to dig into, but people look at a lack of efficiency as beneficial. So they look at the lack of efficiency of gluconeogenesis and how wasteful it is, like energetically wasteful. And they consider that to be a good thing because they're thinking, oh, well, it's the equivalent of burning more calories and that accounts for weight loss. And yeah, it does, but it's stress. It's a lack.
But I think even in that argument, like, the amount of calories extra they burn, I don't think is enough to actually make a significant dent in weight loss in most of these issues.
I've actually seen some studies to suggest that basically the difference in caloric expenditure between high protein, low carb diets and higher carb, low protein diets I guess it was just that some of it can be attributed to gluconeogenesis. I don't remember the exact amount, but it was like a portion. It's a pretty inefficient process, but yeah, that's not like wasting calories is not the goal. Wasting energy. I mean, shouldn't even say calories in that context. Wasting energy is not the goal. The goal is
and then you have to think that when the body's undergoing this, it's also down regulating its energy expenditure because it doesn't it doesn't. So like, yes,
that's secondary.
Increasing the amount of calories burned for this process, but you're also lessening the utilization of calories or energy somewhere else because you have to undergo this process.
Right. And that's half besides the point. I mean, because the whole idea is that we want to have this excess surplus of energy to improve the function of our brains or, repair and repair our tissues and any other kind of degeneration that's going on. And so, yeah, when you're wasting energy because you have to convert protein to sugar, which again, you're still not getting enough sugar anyways. I mean, you're getting like the minimum amount.
Yeah. Just enough that's necessary for nervous system function and some other random functions. Right.
And then that secondarily, that kind of stress, that lack of energy then leads to reduced metabolism overall, reduced energy expenditure overall, because it reduces thyroid function, which is really kind of the main metabolic regulator via the stress hormones.
And increases reverse T3 and things like that. So like literally, even if you did have thyroid hormone, like you dig yourself into a hole essentially.
Yeah.
Because it's not like reverse T3 and thyroid hormone kick back up just like that as soon as you start eating carbs. Like, and we both know it because we've both been on the diets. Like, it's easier to not get in the hole than it is to get out of the hole. Because once you're in the hole, coming out is sort of a long and arduous experience and a lot of trial and error. Because your body gets very efficient in that particular area. And like, yes, you can metabolic switch, but it's sort of a long way back. So I would think that it's more important to get the optimal amount that you need so that you don't have to run on backup pathways. It's like you don't want to drive a car and have to get out and push it, like, because you don't have enough gas. Like, yes, the car still goes. Like, you can still make the car go. You don't want to have pedals underneath your feet and have to pedal the car to go because you don't have enough gas, and that's the backup pathway. It doesn't make any sense. You just make sure you have enough gas. But you also don't want to put gas mixed with, I don't know, water or put a banana in a tailpipe. Like, you have to use the right fuel for the car for it to function. I think, you can't just eat up on donuts and think that you're going to recover. It's just not. It's not a realistic way to go about it. So with that, and I guess with carbs, just to go into, I guess, where we left off from there.
We didn't quite finish blood sugar. So do you mind if I?
Yeah, go ahead.
And then I'll let you take on the rest of carbs, and then we'll go to fats. So We basically are the sugar in our blood, or our blood supplies sugar for our nervous system, for our brain, and kind of the rest of our nervous system. And so it's really important to maintain an adequate blood sugar level. And our bodies have really a lot of the stress hormones, well, really all the stress hormones like cortisol, adrenaline, glucagon, and then you also have insulin. Those are kind of the major blood sugar regulating hormones, which most people don't realize. I mean, it's not something that's talked about much, especially in kind of the low carb crowd, because it doesn't really benefit their whole premise. Which is basically that when the blood sugar drops, because we're not supplying sugar to our brain, our stress hormones increase. And the stress hormones will then increase the supply of sugar, and they'll do it a few ways. They'll either release sugar from the liver that's stored as glycogen. And if there's not enough there, then they'll start breaking down kind of protein. So they'll break down our tissues, whether it's muscles or organs or bones or whatever it is, to convert that to sugar, and then that'll be produced as sugar. Or be used as sugar by the brain. And then as these processes are going on, we'll also increase fat oxidation and reduce carb oxidation outside of the brain. And then as they continue, we'll also start to produce ketones, which will supply the brain with fuel again when there's a lack of sugar.
Once we run out of glycogen stores, which we don't have quite as much as.
Yeah, there's not very much.
It is like basically our short-term food supply, like the signal for our body that, hey, we have enough supplies here.
Yeah. And so this blood sugar regulation is important for a few things. Firstly, it basically suggests that because basically every few hours our blood sugar is going to begin to drop, it means that if we don't eat along with this schedule, then we're going to be putting our body under stress where it has to supply sugar from somewhere else. And it also requires eating carbohydrates during that period of time.
And when you get used to this, you will feel the shift. You can definitely feel the shift when your blood sugar drops once you get used to eating consistently enough carbs.
Right. Well, and so most people are in a constant state of stress hormones, essentially, where you aren't going to notice fluctuations in blood sugar because
it's stable. It's
stabilized by these stress hormones, which release sugar into the blood. And so, especially on a low carb diet, this is one of the biggest issues with it, is that because you're not supplying carbohydrates from the diet, you essentially always have high stress hormones that are having to supply carbohydrates either from protein or, well, really just from protein. And then it gets spared from, you don't need as much carbohydrate because you're using more fat and more ketones, but you still need some, and it requires stress in order.
Yeah, your nervous system definitely needs some. Yeah. And a lot of people mention that they don't get blood sugar swings on low carb diets. And it's true, right. You don't. You're very stable because you don't really have any insulin or any type of sugar coming in exogenously. So there's not much regulation. It's just, you just use cortisol. Like you just rely on the cortisol pathway, at least from what I understand. You just rely on cortisol pathway and gluconeogenesis from the liver to just keep pumping out enough sugar, which, I mean, if you're in ketosis, it just works for people. Or if you don't do ketosis the right way, like me, and you eat a ton of protein, then you just oxidize the protein. You just wind up turning the protein into sugar and oxidizing it from there.
So from this blood sugar regulating perspective, that's part of why there's part of the issue with the low carb or ketogenic diets is that you require these high stress hormones because you still need some sugar. And also just the production of ketones requires stress hormones.
Yeah. And it shuts down energy production. And this is evidenced by the thyroid, like lack of thyroid hormone.
Right. Well, and that's, I think, mostly done via the stress hormones, where the stress hormones then have direct effects on thyroid hormone production and so some other hormones that all end up down-regulating metabolism.
Yeah. Well, if you look at people, I mean, there's the people on the ketosis diets. I think some people talk about like their sex hormones, like testosterone and things like that on these low carb diets, just like going in the garbage. I mean, there's the guy who's like famous for the carnivore diet. His name's Dr. Sean Baker.
Okay.
He like recently posted his testosterone, and I think it was in the 200 or 300s.
Wow.
On his carnivore diet, which is meat and fat. And so it shows like this is where, I mean, this leads in nicely, but carbs are essential for proper hormone function.
Yeah.
So a lot of people on the paleo sphere, you say, oh, like carbs destroy hormones. If you want to balance your hormones, don't eat any carbs, don't eat any sugar, things like that. And it's like,
Yeah.
I don't know where they got that from, but if you really want to balance your hormones out, you really want to have, higher androgens, whether testosterone, DHT, have optimal, enough progesterone, have enough thyroid function. You need to have optimal carbohydrate.
Right. Well, and because you need to have optimal thyroid function. So these hormones are produced from cholesterol and they require thyroid hormone and vitamin A. And so if you're on a low carb diet, which is depressing thyroid function, and then you're not going to have the conversion of cholesterol to these protective steroids. And they are protective and they also help to regulate metabolism as well. So it's kind of another secondary mechanism of reducing the metabolism when your body's in this low carb starvation state.
Yeah. I like to see it as like a snowball on a fulcrum. You can go down either side, and either side you start going down, like it has a sort of feed forward effect on itself. It's like an avalanche, like it grows, the snowball grows grows in size. So as you go down the stress side, like it takes a lot to push that snowball back up the hill, because at the bottom is heavier. Whereas on the other side, you start moving into the other direction. You have a long ways to go before you really tap into like significant amounts of stress. And I think that's what people see with younger people being able to handle things a little bit easier than older people. It's just they have more. I mean, and one of the things they talk about specifically is in the adrenal gland, you have a particular layer. I think I'm not sure which specific one it is, but over time with increasing stress, the layer that produces DHEA, pregnenolone, and I think progesterone starts to decrease with increasing amounts of cortisol and stress hormones, with increasing activation. So with young people, when you get a stressful event, you produce cortisol and you also produce DHEA, which balances out cortisol. They have like somewhat opposing actions. Whereas cortisol turns off the immune system, DHEA functions to support cell-mediated functions in the immune system and supports oxidative metabolism, things like that. So there's a balancing effect. When you have stress, you have an adaptive hormone like cortisol that helps you deal with it, and then you have DHEA, which limits the damage. So it's a very intelligent system. But what you wind up having when you get older is you just have cortisol. So the system, after you sort of lose that layer, and that layer does degrade over time. I mean, I'm not sure if it just degrades over time because of time, or because maybe an excess of stress and not enough nutrients and substrate going in, too much reliance on that. Because I'm sure that I'm not sure, but it could be possible that if you function, you have optimal energy sources, nutrients and whatnot going forward, and you sort of limit the stress hormone cascade, you don't necessarily have to degrade that layer throughout your life. But yeah, essentially you start to see, and like even the ratios that they talk about for chronic diseases is an increase in cortisol with a less DHEAS. Like that is a new ratio that they are using. I think one of the ones was Alzheimer's disease that I saw on the forum. Okay. So that's if you want to talk about just the importance of hormones and not running on the stress system in and of itself there, I think that's a key place to start. But I know we're sort of getting away from the importance of sugar here. But yeah, I think hormonal, the nervous system function, hormones, and specifically in the nervous system function, just to function cognitively at an optimal level, I think carbs are necessary, specifically sugar. And by sugar, I mean more than not just glucose, like glucose and fructose. And I think a lot of people think that these are like evil. I know we touched on it in the previous podcast. But basically, if you have a 1-to-1 ratio of the glucose to fructose, and it's coming from fruits, you shouldn't develop the issues that are normally associated with sugar as something that's inflammatory. Whereas we discussed that the inflammation with sugar was mostly related to the bacterial fermentation of the sugar itself, and not necessarily like the fructose itself. Not fructose isn't the issue. So I think so far we have nervous system function, thyroid function, and then basic hormonal function. And then obviously optimizing cellular metabolism and CO2 production is dependent upon oxidizing glucose over fats. Although you will always have some sort of fatty acid oxidation going on. It's sort of a matter of percentage.
Yeah, definitely. And we can go. We don't have to go into any more depth of how stress affects all the protective hormones. But maybe we could circle back and now talk. I think we covered kind of the importance of carbohydrates. Do you want to now talk about fats?
Yeah, fats. This is actually one that I'm more interested in recently, just because of my personal experience specifically. A lot of people get into Pete and they start going towards low-fat diets because some of Pete's quotes regarding low-fat milk and losing weight and things like that. Because I think a lot of people gain weight when they start Pete, so then they think, oh, if I lower my fat, I won't gain any fat. And then I think a lot of people run into issues. I've seen a lot of low-fat. I guess dogma would be the word I would say on the Pete forum, where people say it just makes you fat, it causes cancer, this and that. I don't think, well, from my experience, fat isn't making you fat directly. Then this is just me eating probably a very large amount of fat for what people on the forum may think is actually good. But just for some of its benefits, I would say in terms of digestion, I think it's extremely important. I think in terms of sterilizing the small intestine and stimulating peristalsis in the intestines, I think it's a very, very important macronutrient. The fat itself stimulates the intestine, and then the release of bile from long chain saturated fatty acids also stimulates the intestine to undergo peristalsis. And then the bile itself and the fats itself protect against endotoxin. So the medium chain triglycerides and that are saturated, and then the saturated long chain fatty acids both have different pathways which they protect from endotoxin and sterilize the small intestine. And I think that's very important for a lot of people because I think a lot of people get a lot of bloating issues and IBS type stuff and SIBO type stuff when they go on these really low fat diets that are very high in sugar. I think a lot of people see some issues. And you can see that throughout the forum, people talking about IBS and this and that, and they're bloating after they eat certain foods. I think it's and then a lot of people talk about constipation. I think those are definitely issues. The next thing I would say for fat is we always have fatty acid oxidation going on. And I think that there's a glucose or a sugar sparing effect that fat has on the body. So at least for me, from my personal experience, if I don't eat enough fat, I tend to get my muscles tend to tighten up after a long shift, so after working 12 or 13 hours. But if I eat an adequate amount of fat throughout the shift, and it's not like, I mean, it's a lot for me, but I'm a relatively large person, about 200 pounds at 6'2", so I have a decent amount more muscle mass than I guess the average guy would have. So I would say that I may eat a little more than other people, but there's an adequate amount to, I think, fuel the muscular system, because at rest, the muscles tend to burn fatty acids, at least from what I understand. So because you have some amount of fatty acid oxidation going on, I think you need enough just to support your body. And I think the next point is, I think fat helps people to last between meals by sparing that sugar, and also possibly slowing down the digestion a bit. So it's like a nice drip of sugar into the portal vein to the liver to regulate blood sugar. And I found for me, I can last much longer between meals if I have an adequate amount of fat with the meal. Then the last point, I guess there's two more points. The last one we can discuss together, but the next one I would say is
do you mind if I jump in real quick?
No, go for it.
I don't want you to forget your points, but I do think that a lot of times people talk, especially I see this in the repeat groups, people will talk about starch. Some of the people in favor of starch will talk about starch improving their ability to last between meals. And almost everyone is having starch with a pretty decent amount of fat. Because I mean, I don't know very many people who are eating, potatoes without it, at least who are from the repeat crowd or things like that. And so I think that it's really the fat that's making a larger difference, because it is known that the starch is digested typically much quicker and has a much higher glycemic index and things like that. So outside of the potential digestive irritation and fullness effect, I do think because I've noticed that myself too with starch, where it can when I eat starch, sometimes it's like can lead to some blood sugar stabilization. But I think it has more to do with the fat than the sugar, like the fat slowing the digestion rather than the starch itself.
The starch for me, I have had like the plain starch by itself. Over time with the starch, I think it helps me last between meals when I have eaten consistently through days, because I think for me at least, it increases bloating, and then it also I think increases, depending on how you tolerate it. Some people may or may not. I think it increases bacterial growth in the intestine, and I think that can increase serotonin to some extent, because it definitely, like, after a few days of eating too much starch, I get bloating, and then I also get like a decrease in appetite, specifically for the starch. Like, I just don't want it. It's just like, and then something that's been talked about on the forum before, but I think people, when you have that craving for starch, I think they've talked about it as being like you have high free fatty acids and you want something to spike your blood sugar. But I also know for me that when I've wanted to have starch is generally when I've had when I like craving something fatty, like I haven't had enough fat. I generally want like a starch meal or like a cookie or something like that. That's usually after I haven't eaten enough. For a while, I was eating more coconut oil than long chain fatty acids, and I would sometimes crave something that was high in fat. It's like rice with a ton of butter or something like that. So yeah, I think that there could, because it comes with the fat, that could be one with the starches. And then the other thing is because it may have like a serotonin effect. I know a few people who eat mostly starch diets, and they tend not to be very hungry, and they eat, like bagel for breakfast, and then they last till lunch, and I think it is a bacterial issue. I
Yeah,
don't think that it's
digestive irritation,
yeah,
intestinal irritation, definitely.
yeah. So I think that's definitely an issue with starches. Some people do well with them. Some, I guess, I don't do well with them at all. And I've tried many times, and you've been there with my experiments.
Yeah. I have too, and I seem to do better with less starch for the most part.
Yeah.
There are certain types that are better than others for me.
Yeah. Then the last 2 points for fats. The first one was for hormone production. Your fat, like, and there's studies basically showing this in men with an X percentage of fat in the diet. I think it was like 40% testosterone production was optimized. And something that's important to note is that the higher the saturated fatty acid percentage to the PUFA percentage, so the polyunsaturated fatty acid percentage, the better the testosterone, and also the better the thyroid function. The thyroid function wasn't in ratio like that. It was just looking at the effects of polyunsaturated fatty acids on thyroid signaling and things like that. So the more PUFA you have, the less hormone production you're gonna have going on for you. So the goal is to stick to monounsaturated was fine. It didn't really have, it was sort of neutral, didn't have too much negative effects. Actually, if you wanted, for men, and this goes to our point later, if you wanted to increase your testosterone the most, it was with a mix of monounsaturated and saturated fatty acids. And the more of those you had, the better the testosterone level was in the men. And for women too, that you had a higher estrogen and progesterone concentration. Then the last point for fats, I was going to talk about I think I was going to talk about oxidizing oxidation of fats versus sugar, and how people think that you can only eat one or the other, because one, if you have fats, you'll oxidize fats. If you have sugar, you'll oxidize sugar. So I think that I was going to start off and say that there's various different functions for fats and sugars beyond just being purely oxidized. And I definitely think that you can have issues if you have too much sugar and too much fat in a meal together. And I've had issues myself. And then too much of certain types of fat. Like if you're going to eat a ton of coconut oil, you could have some issues with that. Whether, I think Dave Ashby calls it disaster pants. And I know for me, like if I've had way too much coconut oil in a meal, I get some type of like, it's almost like a liver pain from it.
Well, you also don't have a gallbladder.
That's true.
Which could be playing a role.
Yeah. And then also a lot of people get bloating when they first start coconut oil. And I think that that's because it's a strong antifungal. There's actually studies showing where they gave rats, they inoculated them with candida, which is a type of yeast, a type of fungus. And then they basically gave them coconut oil, and the coconut oil just over time from just eating it in their diet just basically wiped out the yeast. So I definitely think that there could be effects from it with that. And then the other effects too is when you first start eating fat, if you haven't had fat in a long time and you eat a long chain fat like beef tallow or cocoa butter, you can have a strong bile acid release from the liver. And until your body adapts to this new sort of normal, sometimes you can get diarrhea. And some people, if you have like stones in the gallbladder or anything like that from eating really low fat diets for a long period of time, and then you start eating fat again, that you could have release like that, things like that. So that's something to keep in mind because fat's a strong stimulator of bile release and intestinal peristalsis.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and I mean, there's a lot of other potential issues that you can have, if you're not producing enough bile, for example, that can also cause issues with digesting fat. But along with, as you mentioned with the oxidation of fat and carbs for energy. And so a lot of times you'll hear about the Randle cycle, which is basically that the mitochondria of the cells, when they're using carbohydrates to produce energy, it prevents them from using fat to produce energy, and then vice versa. And which is accurate. But as you talked about, there's a couple of points to make. Firstly is that you can have different tissues oxidizing different substrates. So some tissues could oxidize fat and others could oxidize carbohydrates. And that's not
like muscles at rest.
Sure. Yeah. And that's not like accounted for entirely by that cycle inside of a cell. It's only in a single cell.
Yeah.
And then another thing that you mentioned is that these things are like carbohydrates and fats are used for other functions, especially fats. So if you weren't eating any fat and you had to essentially, I almost said, if you had to use carbohydrates to produce fats, which again is not efficient, similar to protein conversion to carbohydrates, although this one is much less stressful, the carbohydrates to fat production. But then you're essentially wasting carbohydrates, or you're using this ideal energy source and you're having to produce fat for all these other functions. It's important for like as a structural component in all of our cells, like as a major structural component. A lot of times people only think about protein, but they talk about fats in the membranes, which is kind of a whole other topic about those membranes not really existing, but fats are still an important component of the structural.
Especially for the nervous system, because I know we're going to talk about the brain later, but the nervous system functions or deals significantly with fat.
Yeah.
Particularly the brain. Yeah,
definitely, for like myelination and things like that. So fat is important to you structurally. And so kind of what we were talking about earlier with the essentiality of nutrients, it's actually, and the intelligence of our system. It's really cool what our bodies can do when we don't get enough of certain nutrients. For example, with the various minerals like sodium and potassium and calcium, they can kind of be used in place of each other, or essentially that's kind of what goes on. And when we don't have enough of one, or we have an excess of another, and again, same kind of thing with protein, fat, and carbohydrates. But ideally, we would have enough of all of them so that we're able to use them all.
Backup systems to produce them. And I don't know if people have ever really gone on a super low fat diet, because for me, I was having adrenaline rushes. Like if I didn't have enough sugar every hour, like I had to keep just drinking sugar from orange juice or whatever it was all the time, every hour. Because if not, you start, as soon as your blood sugar drops a little bit, or the fatty acids in your blood drop a little bit, you get an adrenaline rush. And the adrenaline's function is to release fat from fat stores, and you feel it pretty strongly.
Sorry.
Go ahead.
Okay. I was just going to say that I do know of some people who are coming from like obesity or very overweight. And I do think for them, they may not need to consume as much fat because their bodies are going to have more of a propensity just naturally to be having more fat release, more lipolysis.
I was very lean when this was happening. So
yeah. So I do think that there may be another variable there. And maybe that is part of why Ray makes some of those recommendations about reducing fat intake in certain instances. Is yeah, if you are very overweight, then you're already going to have more lipolysis going on. So perhaps you don't need to eat quite as much.
Well, I would say you probably could survive better on lower fat if you are overweight. But the thing that I would also say is I think weight is more of a circumstance of inflammation and hormone profile. So you don't really want to go on super low fat diets to lower your weight and then kill basically if you're a man, your androgen production. And if you're a female, some of the other hormones functioning for you, progesterone, estrogen, whatever it is. So that, I mean, those hormones directly function in helping to get rid of some of the weight. I mean, testosterone and DHT, you give them to, I think, obese rats or overweight rats, and it literally leans them out.
That's true.
So I think go ahead.
I was just going to say, if you do have more of the fat release going on and you are overweight or obese, then you do have that substrate for producing those androgens or other hormones.
Yeah.
So
assuming it's not pupa.
Yeah. Well, and assuming that your digestion is okay and that you're eating enough fat to stimulate bile production.
Yeah. Which I think in the study that I saw, I think it was 10 grams of fat, like from a long chain source, saturated fat, was able to like induce an 80% contraction of the gallbladder.
Okay. Sorry. I just was thinking about how we haven't talked about a single topic that we said we were going to talk about yet. So, I zoned out of what you were saying, and I was going to try to circle back and talk about vegetables a bit, but you can finish your thought. I didn't mean to interrupt you with my.
No. It's all right. It's all right. We definitely haven't got. Well, I mean, I guess this leads into it well, because before we even get there, I think it's helpful to say, as opposed to like looking like ratios of nutrients are important, but I also think having adequate amounts of them are important as well. So just setting even for macro, like just setting like ratio or like a standard limit isn't necessarily enough. Like there's an interrelation between the ratio with them, and then specifically for macros, like there is an adequate amount. It's not just like there's this many calories and you divide it up in percentages. You need to have an adequate amount of protein, and then you need to have an adequate amount of carbs, and you need to have an adequate amount of fat, and those can be adjusted by different things happening within your life. And I would say for people, the calories in, calories out, I don't think you want to go into all that now, but basically I think it's more important to eat certain types of food. And if you're going to limit anything, limit what types of food you're eating and what specific foods you're eating, and not worry about the amount. Eat till you're full, eat till you're satisfied, eat till you have enough of what you need for your body. And I don't think you're going to find that you're going to gain too much weight or have too many issues in that particular department. I know, at least for you and I, we eat to our satisfaction pretty much all day long, but we do limit what particular foods that we are eating. And I think that makes more of a difference than the calories in, calories out, just because the hormonal effect of food and even the pharmacological effects of different foods are much stronger than just the basic calories in, calories out. I think they have a much stronger basis on the physiology. And I think that that's way more important to the overall system than simply the sort of basic linear equation.
Yeah. Well, and I'll touch on the calories in, calories out a bit, but I do want to be careful with that sort of recommendation of just eat till you're full, for a couple of reasons. One is that for people who are older or have gone down a further degenerative path and their metabolism is really tanked and they're dealing with a lot of issues and maybe they have a lot of gut issues going on, it's you can't just go all in.
That's definitely true.
Yeah, you're gonna have to go slow, test things, potentially address the gut function and metabolism with other means, like with certain supplements that can be helpful temporarily. Yeah, so I just want to kind of put that out there.
Yeah, not necessarily just till you're full. I mean, you need to meet an adequate amount, and and this goes back to the physiologic effects of food, which ties in nicely with vegetables and some of these like high protein diets and things like that. They will get rid of your hunger. They will satiate you. If you eat a ton of fiber and a ton of vegetables, you will not be hungry, and you you can
drink a ton of
probably
water.
yeah, you could probably take in a ton of water, a ton of protein, and a ton of vegetables, not meet the amount of calories necessary for your body to function and not have hunger. Because the protein will just satiate you, and the vegetables, depending on what they are, even if you, especially if you're eating a lot of raw vegetables, will most likely irritate your intestine, cause increase in bacteria, and probably increase your serotonin and lower your appetite. And I know I directly have experienced this myself. And I think a lot of people in extreme cases of this, they call it the flu. I would say it's more like endotoxin poisoning or bacterial overgrowth from something that's irritate or like a straight irritation of the intestine, something along those lines. Um, and I think it's very weird that people find it weird that these different foods irritate the intestine, because especially because like if you look at your skin and you see the things that irritate your skin, and then you look at like the mucosa of your mouth, the mucosa of your mouth is significantly more sensitive than your skin. Like
Right.
it's a very fragile, delicate structure. So like some of these things, like raw kale, like you might as well just eat Brillo pads.
Oh man, that is quite a comparison.
But you see what I'm saying? It's very, very coarse, very rough.
Yeah.
I mean, if you were to just rub kale all over your skin, you'd probably get irritated too.
That's true. Although again, it's not like the physical characteristic of it being rough that makes
Well,
it
yeah, amongst
irritating.
other things in the food.
Yeah. I mean, hopefully we're chewing enough, and that's a whole separate topic, but hopefully you're chewing enough to where the actual like physical texture of it doesn't make a difference. But yeah, I mean, so we can talk about the vegetables. I just want to also mention, just as far as the kind of high protein, low fat, low carb, high vegetables, drinking a lot of water scenario, the amount that can tank your metabolism, and yeah, you can be not hungry. And I've had clients that are, would consistently eat like 1,000 or 1,200 calories a day. Yeah, it's just really incredible. But
you will survive. You will survive doing that, and you probably won't be as bad as if you were eating like the standard American diet. But it's definitely not an optimal place to be. I know this may be
you're starving yourself of energy that you need for everything, and then you have all sorts of things can come out of that. You can have deterioration of things like your skin and hair and nails, and you can also have more serious degeneration of whether it's like some sort of chronic condition like an autoimmune situation, or I'm sure you're probably dealing with brain fog and just like a lack of energy overall, a lot of fatigue.
You burn out that cortisol pathway real fast.
Yeah.
And
so maybe we can talk a little bit about vegetables, because vegetables outside of Ray Pete's small community, vegetables are really kind of the holy grail of health. It's just, especially raw vegetables. Raw vegetables are just kind of it's just low calories, mostly water, and you have your micronutrients, you have your minerals and vitamins. I don't know what else you can need, but So from this kind of mainstream perspective, vegetables are really kind of the ideal foods, and they're so.
I don't know how many studies you see online of like association of fruit and vegetable intake and this disease, and it's like everyone, if you eat fruits and vegetables, you're just gonna live forever.
Right. Yeah, and they really shouldn't be categorized together. They're very different. I mean, we can even talk about, well, I think it's important to talk about really kind of the, I guess you could say, evolutionary background of these foods, where fruits are developed by plants to be eaten by animals or mammals, where you eat the fruit and then you spread the seeds, which don't get digested. And so because of that, they've made these fruits enticing to us, and by providing all of the things that we need in these fruits. They have sugar that we use as fuel, and they do have vitamins and minerals as well. They're easy to digest, and this makes them really ideal food sources. Whereas vegetables, and I should probably specify here that there's the things that we call vegetables kind of from a culinary sense is different from the scientific sense. So like bell peppers, for example, are fruits. They're not, from the science sense, they're fruits. They're they're higher in sugar, and they have the seeds in the middle that are meant to be dispersed.
Mm-hmm.
So the fruit vegetables are not as big of an issue. Things like bell peppers are fine. And again, because they're
Not
made to,
green bell peppers, though, I would say are probably more.
yeah,
And
yeah,
I guess you can get in that too ripeness as a measure of like eatability.
yeah, the fruit we should be eating should be right off the tree. And obviously, with the food supply we have now, it's very tough to get, and that's part of the reason why we suggest fruit juice a lot, because you can get pretty decent quality fruit juice, and you also don't have the fiber from the fruit, which can be irritating, especially if it's not ripe.
Well, the other point that I think is important to make about fruit. So like your vegetables in general, or your vegetables and fruit in general, besides like having irritating fiber qualities, contain compounds, chemicals, whatever it is, which is what most of our drugs are based off of, that are pesticides, herbicides, fungicides, whatever it is. Yeah, it's like a chemical warfare, because they don't have claws, they don't have teeth, they don't have nails, they don't run away. So you have to manufacture things, and plants are basically master chemists. So with fruit, the irritating aspect is the outer skin, because the outer skin is, and the thing is you can see this in studies. Where are all the antioxidants located in fruits? It's always in the skins. It's always, you want the dark purple skin. And the thing is yes, those are antioxidants, and this goes in with the hormesis thing. But they're basically like irritating compounds. They're irritating chemical compounds that are pesticide, herbicide, fungicide. I mean, there's a reason that your grapes don't rot for an X period of time, and that's because of the skin on them. As soon as the skin is broken, it's very easy for these whatever mold.
If you think about where mold grows on the fruit, it's always kind of in a place where you have a divot in the skin, or like it's punctured.
Yep. So the protective aspect of these fruits is the skin, and it's the same thing for vegetables, which are relatively homogeneous throughout with the compounds. I mean, there's concentrations of different chemicals in different areas, but generally the vegetables aren't, like, the plants don't want to be eaten. And I think it's also go ahead.
Well, so part of the difference with the vegetables, which the ones that we'd be talking about that aren't in the fruit category, would be leaves and sprouts and things like that. So that would include kale and spinach and broccoli and cauliflower and Brussels sprouts. And so those would be kind of the true vegetables. And those don't want to be eaten by insects, but they also don't want to be eaten by mammals or other animals. So they not only have chemicals that are not good for the like microbes and insects, they also have what we call anti-nutrients, which prevent them from being digested well by us. They inhibit.
Not only that, they directly inhibit energy production. Like, they go right in for the kill. Like the specifically the cruciferous, which is like the main ones that you mentioned, directly inhibit your energy production. Yeah. And it's very difficult to get rid of these compounds. I mean, I've been eating broccoli lately, and the studies show you have to boil it for like 30 minutes to get rid of 90% of these particular compounds.
And you're talking about the goitrogens that inhibit thyroid function. Yeah.
The supposedly anti-cancer glucosinolates, which basically break down into cyanide-based compounds. So, some of them at least, are like different ions like thiocyanate that inhibit iodine uptake by the thyroid gland. So they go in for the kill. They go for the money shot. Like these.
Yeah, they don't want to be eaten. They need to be able to survive. And if we were able to eat all of them, then they wouldn't reproduce. Whereas the fruits, they need us to eat them in order to reproduce. And so maybe you can talk a little bit too about, I know we mentioned it last time, but just clarify again that those quote unquote antioxidants or polyphenols in the fruits aren't really absorbed. And because they don't have compounds that inhibit our digestion, they basically act as antimicrobial components in our gut. Yeah, that protect our, like the fruit from being eaten by our gut microbes.
Or at least encourage non-pathogenic species in the colon.
Right.
So they inhibit pathogens, and sort of the bacteria that can metabolize it are the bacteria that we've sort of adapted with. but even so, like the skins themselves can be irritating directly. I'm trying to think of a good example of like there's certain fruits that when you eat the skins, it can give, like if you eat too much grapes, the feeling that you get in your teeth and whatnot from the skins. Like there's definitely an astringent effect to some of the fruits, some of the fruit skins specifically, and it's just a protective barrier. It's a protective effect. You don't want insects destroying the fruit before the mammal can eat it and spread the seeds. And the other thing to keep in mind is the skin can speed up peristalsis, so that you get the seeds out there quick, so they're not digested.
Mm-hmm.
And then something also interesting to keep in mind is the seeds in and of themselves generally are even more concentrated with these compounds than the skin is. And some of the seeds, like for example, peach seeds, contain, I think it's latril is what it's called. And people are saying it's vitamin B17 or whatever, and it treats cancer, but it basically releases cyanide in the body. And that's how it kills the cancer cells, from releasing cyanide. So these are protective effects. Even things like coffee. Coffee produces caffeine. The caffeine is a pesticide. The nicotine in caffeine in tobacco is pesticide. Like these things kill insects. It's not like we use them pharmacologically, yes, but all these plants have compounds. I mean, even the major drugs like digoxin is from a flower. The digoxin, the heart medication, comes from, I think it's a flower, digitalis. So all these compounds are protective compounds of the plant. And yes, they have pharmacological effects, but overall their effect is to sort of inhibit mammals and whatnot from eating them. So the real things that are made to eat for us are from the plant world, at least, is fruits.
Yeah. And as you had mentioned, kind of like the pits of, what was the apricot?
Yeah.
We're not meant to digest those pits. And I actually know of apricot seed being used as like a herbal extract.
It's a cancer thing. Like people use
a Hormesis thing. We'll have to talk about Hormesis for a second. But yeah. And we should also mention like nuts and seeds, because they fall into the same category as vegetables, but even more so, because the seeds and nuts are even more important. And this includes the seeds that would be inside the fruit, like the apricot seed or apricot pit. And because these seeds and nuts are the spawns of these plants that then become new plants. So it's extremely important for them not to get eaten or digested. And so we've turned nuts and seeds into foods. And this would include grains as well. But they contain a lot of these anti-nutrients that are meant to prevent them from being digested from animals like us, and they inhibit
and
protein.
Cause problems over time, so that you don't go back and eat them again.
Right. Yeah, and this include they inhibit protein digestion. They also cause like direct inflammation, which like the lectins, which includes gluten. Those fall into the anti-nutrient category. They inhibit the absorption of various minerals, like they bind to various minerals and inhibit their digestion.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, and I actually have an article detailing some of the anti-nutrients in those kinds of foods. So I'll link to that.
And it's not, I mean, almost the lectins, it's not lectins in general as a class, because certain there's lectins in almost every type of food. It's just specific lectins
that are in the nuts and seeds. Foods,
particularly nuts and seeds,
right,
can cause issues with a lot of people. And the people who did eat these foods, because there's a general argument, they ate them for hundreds of years. Like, I think as much as people say Weston A. Price Foundation is quackery and whatnot, there is a lot of detailing of how these foods were particularly prepared in special ways that it required significant amounts of time just to eat them. So, for example, one of the things is, and this isn't necessarily a lectin, but one of the articles, this was Chris Masterjohn, he was basically saying that the people in Africa, they live on partly cassava, which is a root vegetable. It's pretty high in starch.
It's like where they get tapioca from.
Yeah, exactly.
And there's something else too.
But it's also yucca.
Yucca, I think that's what I was thinking of. Yeah.
But it's also very high in the similar compounds to the cruciferous vegetables, where it shuts down thyroid function. So the natives are known for basically taking the cassava and soaking it in a stream for a number of days. and then they boil it, and then they dry it, and then they pound it down into. So like this process is very laborious just to eat this one particular food. Luckily, we don't have to do that now. But the part of the problem is we don't actually do these things with our foods anymore. Fermenting grains, like for example, sourdough bread. Traditional sourdough bread is made with lactobacillus bacteria, and the lactobacillus break down the peptide, these particular lectins and peptides in wheat like gluten, so that they're not offensive anymore. And so bread in the past they didn't just take yeast and add water and salt and let the dough rise. They basically fermented the bread, and the bacteria were breaking down some of these peptides and inhibiting the negative effects. So you see all these, people ate bread for hundreds of years. Yeah, they didn't eat bread like we eat bread now. They weren't eating cassava like we eat cassava now. They weren't just getting beans in a can. You know, the beans were soaked and taken for. And the other thing to keep in mind is some foods that we consider foods now, by ancient populations, were not considered foods. Yeah. Like, well, there's in Nutrition and Physical Degeneration, and then The Fat of the Land by Stephenson, they talk the natives did not eat a lot of green leafy vegetables to prevent cancer and this and whatnot. These people were eating mostly animal products and fruits, and some peoples were eating they were eating nuts and seeds, some of the tropical populations, but that's a little bit different. Some of the nuts and seeds from that area, like not necessarily coconut, but I think there's cola nut, and all these different ones have different effects. Like chocolate has different effects as well. But basically, a lot of these foods weren't actually foods, or weren't considered foods that we have now. And some of the ones that were prepared vastly differently than what we're doing today. So I think those are important to consider for a lot of people and really question what actually is food now.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, and the way that we're inundated with this information that we just assume, we assume that not only that vegetables are food, like not only that vegetables, we assume that, not only are they food, but that they're like the healthiest foods for us. But yeah, I mean, we could very well reconsider whether or not we really want to call them foods, at least some of them. Same with nuts and seeds. So at least in the present form, in the same way you mentioned chocolate, you can't just go and eat, what is that, cocoa pod?
Cacao beans are like fermented and laid out into the sun for days before they're even processed.
Yeah, same with coffee.
Yeah,
and they're fermented too, and they go through a really extensive process. So you wouldn't call the original coffee bean food really either. So it's definitely kind of like I don't know. We have to change the way that we're thinking about it.
Yeah.
All right. Well, let's talk about hormesis for a quick second, just because we teased it earlier, and I can't keep teasing it and not talking about it. And then maybe we'll get to like one question.
Okay.
All right. So we've mentioned hormesis a couple times today, and then a couple times in the last podcast. And I also have an article that will eventually be coming out on hormesis. It's been a really kind of large undertaking, and there've been a lot of other circumstances coming into play. But so I figured we could talk a little bit just about hormesis in general and some of the issues with it. So
I think it goes well with what we were just talking about, particularly the antioxidant compounds and whatnot that people are raving about now.
Yeah. So hormesis is essentially, and there's an issue with defining it because the definition has changed over time. But hormesis began with the idea that a small amount of a very toxic chemical could produce,
or anything like that.
Well, it was originally specifically about very toxic chemicals.
Okay.
And it was the idea that a small amount of the toxic chemical would cause a defensive reaction in the body that would improve resilience, essentially, and improve health. And there were quite a few studies about this, and they would find, they would like look at cadmium or methylmercury or whatever it was, and they would find that if it was administered, it may reduce the incidence of cancer in a certain scenario. But then when looking at the research as a whole, it would reduce the risk of other types of cancer or something like that. And it was also used to defend radiation, ionizing radiation, especially around kind of the testing of the atomic bombs.
The idea of hormesis was used to defend the radiation ideas.
So basically,
not methyl mercury or cadmium.
Well, no, it was.
No, methyl mercury and cadmium weren't used to defend against radiation. The idea of hormesis was used to defend against mercury, cadmium, and then now specifically radiation.
Yes. Thank you for clarifying if I didn't.
No, because for a second when I was listening, I was like, wait, and then I got it.
Okay.
Maybe it was just me. Maybe your audience is smarter than I am.
Who knows? Wouldn't take much, right?
Definitely not. Because I'm just knowledgeable. I don't have any wisdom. I only have knowledge.
It's true. So and then it was also, it came around, the idea of hormesis came around in this time of the atomic bomb testing and was used to defend the low doses of ionizing radiation that people were being exposed to. And maybe it's also worth mentioning that for decades after that, different forms of ionizing radiation, like X-rays, were used as medical treatments for like rheumatoid arthritis or even for acne, which, if you would think about it now, I mean, it's so well known that X-rays cause cancer, and they have a cumulative effect, and so it's really crazy to look back at that and then consider what kind of things we're doing now in the medical field that we don't really know how safe they are. But I digress. So,
like lobotomies.
Sure. Exactly. So, but the idea of hormesis has kind of lived on, and it's the definition has continued to expand, which I think is kind of a way of protecting the fact that it was such a failure in the beginning. Like, for example, the idea that low doses of ionizing radiation are beneficial, even though we know that they have cumulative effects that lead to cancer. Although there are people now, again, claiming that low doses of it are beneficial. And so the definition has been expanding and has morphed from what used to be a small amount of a very toxic factor can be beneficial to now a general principle that all stressors follow, where essentially the idea is that any stress on the body causes benefits up to a certain dose, and then it causes harm. And
no pain, no gain.
Right, exactly. And so they've called it a biphasic dose response. And so, they use exercise or caloric restriction as kind of common examples for this, where with exercise, they show, exercise is beneficial and it's a stressor. So it must be beneficial because it's a stressor. And so I guess I should explain that a little bit more, where the idea is that the stress itself that these factors cause defensive reactions in our bodies that are supposedly beneficial. So
I think a good example is the plant compounds, specifically being strong pro-oxidants and thus inducing an antioxidant cascade within the body. So thus being beneficial by that mechanism.
Yeah.
Because I think exercise is somewhat confusing for people because there are beneficial effects from it outside of the fact of like the hormesis aspect.
And it's important to note both. So it is a good idea. So I think it's important that you brought up those plant compounds as an example to separate from exercise. Because that's the whole issue, is that you have something like exercise where, yes, it causes stress, which essentially just means that it uses energy. But the beneficial effects of exercise are not because of its causing stress. They're because of the movement and other aspects of exercise. You basically have to separate the two. And this was actually,
I think that they're even changing, like, because for a while, even for the like bodybuilding sphere, thought that like tearing of the muscles was the way to grow them, and now the like newer, I guess, theories or understandings are starting to say no, you don't actually have to break down the muscle. You actually would prefer not to do something like that. You more just want to stimulate the muscle,
right? Stimulate it with like muscle tension. But they've also noted that metabolic stress contributes to muscle growth. But you also have to consider whether muscle growth is beneficial for the organism as a whole after a certain point. which I think.
Well, are you synthesizing new muscle with the muscle growth, or are you just increasing the amount of fluid and substrate present in? Because there's like with some of the muscle growth stuff, the metabolic stress I think increases the sarcoplasm or whatever size, as opposed to actually laying down new myofibril and whatnot.
Okay,
I'm not
interesting. I haven't seen that. I haven't seen that research, but
I'm not entirely 100% sure about that one. But what I understand, there's like the different aspects of muscle growth, whether you're lying down new myofibrils, which is like the contractile fibers, or you're actually just increasing the size of the fiber with substrate and whatnot, which I would think the metabolic stress would do more so than the but anyway, it's relatively unimportant overall. But anyway, continue. Sorry.
Sure. Well, and so I need to keep backtracking because I did a relatively poor job of explaining earlier. But one thing that's important to identify is that every factor, and this was based on Hans Selye's work, he really elucidated this idea that every factor has specific effects and it has stressor effects. And so the stress or usage of energy is a universal aspect or feature of all factors, whether it's exercise or eating food, which requires energy to be digested, or it's cold ambient temperature that we need to use energy to warm ourselves up, or an infection, whatever it is, all of these various factors have stressor effects or they use energy. And they also have specific effects where eating food, provides us with nutrients. It can cause digestive irritation, whatever it is. Exercise causes muscular, includes or a part of it is muscular tension and myofascial stimulation, and on for every factor. So it's important to separate these two things. And what Hormesis, or those in favor of Hormesis, are really saying is that it's these stressor effects or this usage of energy that's the beneficial part. And they're more or less ignoring the specific effects. And this is especially true once they've kind of expanded to the biphasic dose response. Whereas before, with the toxic agents, the toxic agents, like the fact that they were toxic, was more of a specific effect. Whereas now they've kind of morphed into saying that the stress itself is beneficial. And they've even gone as far as to suggest that vitamins and minerals themselves are only beneficial because of the stress they cause in this hormetic manner. So it's become really ridiculous. And
so the general principle is you have something and it causes some type of stress, and then causes a defensive reaction by the body. And then because it causes the defensive reaction by the body, then it is beneficial because the defensive action by the body could possibly have beneficial effects.
Yeah.
But it's outside of the idea that in order to induce this protective effect from the body, the body has to utilize resources and energy to mount the response. So really it's more of somewhat of a draining effect overall, depending on what resources you have available and what your context is.
Yeah, it's very reductionist in that sense.
Probably why it's not a good idea to get irradiated, then go exercise, take a little bit of methyl mercury, and then drink your raw kale shake.
Right. Well, yeah. And then in talking about that, if you're suggesting that people should be doing things for the factor, for hormesis, you're also suggesting that they don't already have enough stress, they're past that threshold and they need to be having more, which, considering that it's all cumulative, considering that stress is cumulative, that's a pretty hard, that's a pretty hard claim to make or support.
I think it'd be better to not have the stress overall, but be prepared for the stresses that are inevitable.
Yeah.
I think more of a better way to look at it than to, because we also know you can't avoid all stress.
No, you can't. And it's not like there's no point in even trying to, because every factor we encounter involves stress, and that's okay. The stress itself isn't the issue, but the stress itself isn't beneficial, but the other effects can be, and we're going to run into stress all the time. That's part of it, and that's part of why
we're going to have to use energy because our bodies are constantly streaming the energy. So it's a matter of this is somewhat reductionistic because there's so many factors involved, but the goal is to not to have more stress, more draw of energy from stressors than energy that you actually have going in and can stream through the body.
Right. Yeah. Ideally, we would have the least stress possible and the most beneficial specific effects possible. So if there was,
yeah, exactly. So we can harness the energy to gain from whatever the specific effects or whatever else we're doing.
right. So if there's some way to separate the myofascial stimulation and muscular tension from exercise from the energy required, then it would be better just to get that, just to get those other effects.
But that's entirely not reality.
Yes, it's not reality, and that's okay. Like, we're going to run into stressors, and that's fine. But it's an important distinction to make, that the stress itself is not beneficial, because otherwise you start encouraging the exposure to factors that are quote unquote beneficial just because of the stress they cause.
I think we went through a period when we were of this, specifically with fasting and a lot of vegetables and a lot of like antioxidant compounds.
Yeah, a lot of herbs. We were using a ton of herbs.
Yeah, and a lot of hard exercise every day, and
a low carb diet.
Yeah, and low carbs.
All of which are falling under this Hormesis umbrella, and all of which are really not ideal.
But willpower overcomes everything, and if you have willpower, you could do it all.
There you go. Yeah, and it really just requires, like, it's just a different view of the organism, and recognizing that that these adaptive processes are costing the structure, function, and complexity of the organism. And I guess that's kind of, I don't know if that really did it justice. Maybe we should just leave. I don't know. Maybe we'll just leave that for a completely separate episode, or I'll leave it in. We'll see, as just kind of a brief introduction to.
Well, I think we should distill it down to basically your body's constantly like streaming energy or taking in energy and then utilizing it. And the goal is to not use more energy than the body can stream, than the body can like process overall. And especially in the goal that you're doing it for the stressor. Like it doesn't make sense to use energy for the sake of using energy, or cause an adaptation from whatever, causing a multiple like antioxidant cascade from a pro-oxidant for the sake of doing that.
Or restrict calories for the sake of doing it. It's the exact opposite. Yeah. And so there's this kind of fallacy, which I know we didn't talk about calories in, calories out too much, but this directly comes into play, where there's this idea that
the rate of living.
What's that?
Are you going to the rate of living theory?
No. Well, kind of, but no, I wasn't going there. So there's this idea that the energy we produce can only be either expended, like used to exercise or to change our ambient or our internal temperature, or like something like that, or it becomes fat. And neither of which are the case. Like, first off, energy doesn't become fat. Like, you don't, like, the energy that we produce internally does not get converted to fat. That can't happen. It's when we have excess substrate that doesn't get used to produce energy that becomes fat. Mm-hmm. So there's an important distinction to make there, which that has more to do with the calories in, calories out, and it's kind of a separate topic. But as far as the energy in, energy out idea, excess energy that we have that we aren't using for some external factor of our environment is what drives our structure and function and complexity. It allows us to maintain and repair our tissues.
That is what our life is. That literally is life. If not, we're just a sack of bones.
Right. Yeah. And so that is really what we want to have, a surplus of energy. Mm-hmm. The more energy we produce and the less we use, which is kind of a tough line to draw, because it's not necessarily bad that we use energy, but ideally we want to have excess energy that improves our complexity and improves our cognitive function or
when you have more energy required than you have available, you're dead, basically.
Yeah.
Or you're destroying the structure of the organism.
Right. Yeah. Degeneration. That energy has to come from somewhere, so it comes from our structure. So I guess maybe it would be important to back that up a bit and basically say that, well,
it goes to Ray's hypothesis. Energy and structure are interdependent on every level.
Yeah. And so if we only produce 1,000 units of energy, and because of all these things that we're doing, we're thinking, we're running, whatever it is, we use 1,200 units of energy. Those 200 units have to come from somewhere. Yeah. And so we essentially degenerate or reduce our complexity and that energy is used to make up for these stressors.
Yeah.
And then if you consider the reverse process,
it goes through the adaptive hormones, cortisol and whatnot, which literally breaks down your structure. Like it is known to break down muscle tissue to supply glucose and break down the amino acids like directly.
Yeah, exactly. And so then you have the opposite side, where if you have the energetic surplus, then the opposite happens, where we improve structure, we regenerate, we improve complexity, and that's kind of on the individual level. And then if we were to look on the species level, then you have changes in evolution and kind of adaptations that lead to either increased intelligence or increased muscle mass or increased digestive function, none of which I'm saying are necessarily good or bad. It depends on the context.
I think a good example of this is the locust example that I know some of the repeat people love to hammer on. But basically, when you put grasshoppers in an environment where they basically don't have enough energy, they don't have enough food, substrate, water, whatever, or it's crowded, they basically transform via the adaptive hormones, specifically serotonin, into locusts, where they essentially devolve. So with a regular grasshopper, it eats its grass, whatever, it's not really bothering its neighbor, does what it has to do. But when it loses its, it basically loses its quorum, or its I guess its higher order principle, and moves to a state where it just eats everything in sight, and including other locusts, supposedly.
Yeah, the ravenous, they're what's the cannibalistic? Aggressive,
yeah, and it devolves, it loses that higher order functioning. And it's very easy to see with people too. Take somebody, give them insulin and lower their blood sugar, and tell me how nice they are. Drop someone's blood sugar and tell me if somebody hits their car, what their response is going to be to them. And it's definitely not going to be, it's okay, accidents happen, you must have been having rough. It's going to be like, we all know what it's going to be. We all know what happens when we haven't eaten for a while. And I think that's just and so when you talk about we have enough energy and you're going to stream, you have enough energy on board, you want an excess of energy. People think, oh, excess of energy, okay, so you want us to get obese. But what I don't think, and I know you sort of stipulated that from before, but what I don't think a lot of people understand is that compassion, understanding, intellectual ability, higher order processing, all these are energy dependent. Like your mood and your emotions are energy dependent systems. They're not esoteric, abstract.
It's not separate. Things. It's not our thinking and mindset.
It's dependent on the physiology. So you want to have enough energy when somebody hits your car that it's just it's not going to kill you. You're not going to sit there and have a temper tantrum about it. You sort of, all right, this is the situation. You want to have enough energy when you go to work and somebody yells in your face or whatever it is, that you can sit there and you can understand what their position is. And that is an energy dependent process.
Yeah. Empathy is it's certainly energy dependent.
Yeah. I think a lot of the emotions are, and an inability to regulate the emotions is an energy problem. It is an inability, because basically what they talk about, and this is directly applicable to what they talk about with muscle cells in general, or Pete's principle is that a high energy state is a relaxed state. In order for muscles to actually relax, they require energy, which is why when you die, you get rigor mortis. The muscles are all contracted. There's no more energy. The body's not streaming energy anymore.
Yeah. So just to clarify for people, when rigor mortis is essentially the state where the muscles are all fully contracted.
Yeah. And when you die, when the person dies,
it happens when you die, when you don't have any ATP left. And it's not just based on that, but an idea that most people don't recognize is that the relaxation of our cells actually requires energy. And that's why increasing energy is actually important for being able to sleep and relax, things like that. So go ahead.
And so with higher order functioning in terms of emotions and mood and stuff with the brain, an ability to inhibit or essentially relax a response is wholly dependent on energy. It doesn't happen without it. So all these people with mood stuff and whatever else, and even the higher order thinking, even higher order thinking and processes and whatnot, is an ability to sort of inhibit sort of excess things going on and focus in on particular ideas and whatnot. And it's a directed process. It should be a relaxed process. So a lot of these things, it's very related to the structure and the energy streaming through the structure. It's not, when we are talking about having an excess energy, it's not like getting fat. It's
not at all. And I'll clarify. I can clarify that, but I do think what you're saying is really, really important and kind of speaks to just how important, like the idea that energy is everything is so fundamental, and it's hard to get that point across. And I think that you did a good job by explaining some of those different aspects of our existence that are energy reliant. Just to clarify real quick about the obesity and excess energy idea. So if we were to just talk about carbohydrate, let's say, we use the carbohydrates to then produce energy. So we typically equate the amount of calories we take in as energy, but they aren't energy yet. They're I don't know what's called substrate. So carbohydrates, we say they have 4 calories, but it only has 4 calories if you burn it in a furnace. But but really, like carbohydrate only has energy. The only energy we can get from it requires us to extract the energy from it. And so if we have the carbohydrate and we don't extract the energy of it, and instead we can convert it to body fat. So you kind of have these juxtaposing points where the production of energy or extraction of energy from our food is actually kind of the opposite of obesity and gaining body fat. And there's some really interesting studies showing that excess body fat or obesity are states of low energy and low energy production. And part of the fallacy comes in where people assume, well, we just eat however much food and we extract X amount of energy, and then anything that's left over gets stored as body fat. But that's not how it works. The extraction of energy or the production of energy is affected by all these variables like thyroid hormones and other steroid hormones.
It's a living adaptable system. So if you have more energy to use, the system upregulates processes. If you have less energy to use, or if you have less substrate coming in, or the substrate that you're using is inhibiting the energy production itself, the system down regulates to the level of energy it has available. It's an organic process. It's an intelligent process. It's not linear. And I think that's a lot of problems because the scientific thought processes are reductionistic and linear. And you're trying to categorize and break things down into semantic terms. And it doesn't necessarily work in that way. It's an organic process. And if you want to look at all the interrelating factors that are involved in regulating this process, it's
everything. That's everything.
It's not separate. Right. None of it is separate. And even us from our environment, it's not separate. And I think the idea that it is a hindrance into understanding what actually goes on and to understanding these processes.
Right. And so if you have a situation where, just to give an example, polyunsaturated fats or endotoxin are blocking energy production, well, that's when you then have this buildup of the substrate. You build up of carbohydrates, build up of fats, and that's what leads to the increased fat storage or diabetes. And it also leads to a lack of energy. And as Mike was saying, every factor in our environment affects this process of energy production because it's an entire system. And then when you have less energy available, so when you're producing less energy or when you're using too much energy, when you have less of energy available, we have these adaptive systems to reduce our usage of energy so that way we can survive longer.
Which is what hibernation is, and which is what essentially obesity is.
Yeah. And then you have the opposite side where when we're producing excessive amounts of energy, that again, these allow us to increase our structure, complexity, and function, and regeneration, maintenance of our tissues, repairing of our tissues. So then when we have this excess of energy, that has the opposite effect where our bodies recognize that they're in an enriched environment, an energy resource rich environment, that they then say, okay, well, we can use a lot of energy, and it upregulates our metabolic processes to produce even more. Mm-hmm. And again, all of this then ties back to these other things we were talking about, like blood sugar regulation, where our blood sugar regulation is kind of a short-term or acute monitor of our environment and how energy rich it is or how resource rich it is. And when we are going through scenarios of low blood sugar, it contributes to this reduced energy production. And then vice versa. If we maintain higher blood sugar levels and our body is recognizing, hey, we've got lots of substrate, lots of carbohydrates available, then it will upregulate its metabolism, upregulate its energy production. And again, as we're talking about, that's kind of the fundamental point of our health, is this availability of energy.
Yeah, exactly. Another thing I think that's important for people to know too is you can have enough carbohydrate that's not irritating or bothering the system or whatnot, that like you can utilize and create energy with effective. But if you don't have enough cofactors, vitamins or whatever else, protein, whatever else you need to go in, the lowest limiting factor will limit the system. So it really takes a number of components and compounds that are required to be met for the system to necessarily be optimal. So you can't just go out, buy a bag of sugar, start pounding sugar, and think that you're going to get, oh, I have more energy on board. Because it's not necessarily how it works. It involves many, many components. And it's really, when people, and I think this ties in directly to people's ideas of diets. There's no diet. This is a lifestyle. It's not a diet. This is a change in lifestyle, because the components that are required to really make the difference overall for your physiology are like all encompassing. It's not just, I mean, you can make small steps that make improvements. You don't have to like go full boat all the time, like all at once, but there's really there's many factors that are all very interrelated, and they're dependent upon each other, and you're limiting yourself significantly if you think you can just do one area and have the others fall into place as well.
Yeah, definitely. And we could spend all day talking about all these different factors that come into play.
Yeah.
Did you want to add anything to that, or do you want to move on? I did want to get to at least one of the Q&A questions, but we've already kind of
question, and then that's it.
Yeah. Well, what I was going to say is, so for the first Q&A, which I don't know, maybe we'll have to figure out how we're going to do this in the future, because we just end up talking the whole time. But for anyone interested in having their questions answered in the future, you can send your questions into jay@jayfeldmanwellness.com. It's jay@jayfeldmanwellness.com. And we'll try to get to it. But
emphasis on try.
Right. But Joel had asked how to increase testosterone. And this was something that we already touched on, so I think we can kind of complete it pretty quickly. Earlier, you had mentioned, or we had talked about, the importance of carbohydrates just for having enough energy, stimulating the metabolism, enough to increase thyroid hormone.
I think sources would be important, and I'd stick with mainly fruits and fruit juices.
Okay, yeah, and potentially some starches for people,
potatoes,
because not everyone's gonna be okay just on an only fruit and fruit juice diet.
Yeah, potatoes, sweet potatoes, white rice would be the safest.
Yeah. So that's one aspect that's really important for increasing the conversion of cholesterol to the protective steroids like testosterone. And then you also need to make sure you're getting enough fats. So you have the saturated fats rather than polyunsaturated fats.
Mono are sort of, they're okay. They're like the starch area of carbs.
I wouldn't even put them that far. They're fine. I mean, I think that like most,
you can't avoid them, so I wouldn't even worry.
Yeah, and like most of which again, this doesn't necessarily mean that it's ideal, but monounsaturated fats typically make up the majority of our cellular structural fat composition, and they're much safer, or much more stable, I should say, than
they don't oxidize like polys do.
Hundreds of times more stable.
Yeah.
So
the graph is really funny. The graph, it's literally like omega-3s, omega-6s, and then you just see like there's nothing for saturated fats, and then right there for mono, it's like this little blip.
Right. Yeah, I don't remember the exact values, but maybe it was hundreds of times between saturated and polyunsaturated, not between
I think it was for mono too.
Oh yeah,
I think it was like a number of times in terms of like peroxidability or whatever.
Okay. So it's important to get your fats in order, carbohydrates in order, get enough protein.
The fats, let's just list some sources.
Oh, sure. Yeah. So coconut oil, butter, dairy, cocoa butter, so like chocolate,
I wanted to make a stipulation about dairy, though.
Go ahead.
For some people, the hormones in dairy could definitely be an issue. This is dependent upon what the cow is eating, when the cow is milked, and if they're given hormones and things like that. I've seen some studies where like different concentrations of estrogen and progesterone in butter were like pretty high, especially depending upon how much you eat. So just something to keep in mind for some people if they're not doing well with it. And then the fats that tended to do the best for increasing testosterone were saturated and monounsaturated. They, particularly long chains, they did better than the medium chains from coconut oil. I think some of the studies I showed that tallow actually did one of the best. Tallow, or I think it was like some type of lard from Italy or something like that. So not necessarily lard from the US. The pigs weren't fed soy, let's put it that way.
Right. Well, and the MCTs from coconut oil are used more for energy production rather than other functions.
Yeah.
I do want to say, as far as the hormones in dairy goes, I don't know, we're not necessarily in agreement on that, but I don't know. Well, maybe we'll dive into that another time. But
you drink goat milk, I think that's different. You drink like farm fresh goat milk, whereas
I haven't had an issue with butter. At least I don't think so.
Well, I mean, depends on the person.
Right. So I think it's fine to put out there like a warning for dairy that some people do.
I'm not telling people not to eat it. I'm saying if you have issues with it, that could be possible.
Yeah, definitely. I just wanted to point out that.
And then the other thing, though, is for cheeses or for milks, specifically for dairy, I think it's important to mention that there is a difference between A1 and A2 and the opiate effect of the milk, because the protein in milk can have an opiate effect. It can cause issues with people's dopamine levels, and then for me, it caused issues with like I would say androgens, like my libido, and I did get some acne and weight gain from it. So
just to clarify, what Mike's talking about is that there's certain protein in milk that basically, when we bred all these cows in the US in really terrible conditions, they
and in England.
What's that?
It's in England too. The Western countries. Yeah.
Okay. It's the cows have developed this A1 protein that can cause several of the issues that Mike brought up.
It has an opiate effect, basically.
Yeah, it's essentially a stress factor. And you can also, instead of drinking that milk, you can find milk from cows that only have the A2 protein in their milk, and so
practically not homogenized.
Yeah, trying to keep it accessible for people. What's that?
It can make a difference.
It can. I mean, these are all things to test out. I'm just trying to keep like easy, simple recommendations rather than like, because we could spend hours just talking about recommendations just for one person. So I just wanted to kind of keep it simple. So the same stipulations as always, especially with dairy, make sure you're testing it out. If you can find A2 milk, which there's a brand of A2 milk, that might be better if you're having issues with regular milk, or you could also try something like goat milk, which is also A2. Yeah. And so I think that was it as far as fats goes, right? Fats go.
Yeah, that's pretty solid for fats.
Okay. And then in general, I mean, just trying to keep psychological stress down, making sure you're doing some movement and exercise are important.
Sleep is important.
Sleep is so important. Yeah. And vitamin D too, while we're talking about that. So
vitamin K.
So if you're in a place, what was that before magnesium?
Calcium.
Okay.
They all work together.
Yeah. And if you're in a place where you can get sunshine regularly, definitely try to do that. If not, you can supplement with vitamin D potentially.
Adequate protein to detoxify estrogen from possible aromatization, vitamin E to prevent aromatization, basically just testosterone converting to estrogen. That's what aromatization is.
Oh man, we got to wrap this up, don't we? You're trailing off.
Because like I'm trying to be concise about it.
Yeah.
But the thing is like I don't think about it in like, because I get it. I have like a disconnect upon, because I think everybody knows what aromatization is.
Right,
I wasn't,
which is definitely not the case. Yeah.
which I realized
No,
after
I know.
wasn't the
I know.
case. But then I have this competing aspect in my mind where it's like, well, Jay, you know, he wants to keep this like pretty concise, and it's like, well, then I'm going to talk about aromatization. It's just going to make it more complex.
Oh man! All right. Well, continue on with the supplements you were talking about. You mentioned D, E, K,
Vitamin D, vitamin E, vitamin K,
magnesium, and calcium.
magnesium, calcium. Vitamin C can help lower cortisol levels, which there's cortisol testosterone ratio. You want higher testosterone, obviously. So things that can lower cortisol, which also goes back to adequate carbs.
Yeah.
And then avoiding intestinal irritation, I think, is really important, because once serotonin elevates, it can shut down the gonad system if it's like an extended period of time. So try not to eat things that bother you.
Which would be, I mean, more specifically, foods to look out for: grains, legumes, nuts and seeds, and raw vegetables.
Raw vegetables for sure.
For those are things that can irritate the gut, and that can increase serotonin production. And
yeah. So. And then you already said weightlifting, so
yeah. And again, go ahead. I was saying that also for those vitamins and minerals that were mentioned, we would certainly advocate not supplementing and instead getting it from food. You could potentially supplement some of them, but
vitamin K is hard to get adequately from food. Sure. So I would say vitamin K, you could definitely get, and vitamin E could probably be a good one. The other ones I think are pretty easy to get from food. Maybe not calcium, maybe not magnesium. Depends on what you're eating. Yeah. But yeah, trying to get it from food first, and then sort of filling in the gaps as you go. You can look at using an app like Chronometer to log your food and then fill in see like one day what you're eating, see what you're missing, and sort of fill in from there.
Yeah, I'll link to Chronometer. It's a helpful resource.
Yeah,
where you can log your food. And yeah, I mean, the supplements, I would just be, I'm always very cautious with supplements. So make sure that you're testing it out and that it's not affecting you.
Do you want me to say like brands that are okay, or I'm not really like we're not affiliated with anything, just like the ones that we've tried.
Yeah, we're not affiliated with any, so I think it's fine to say them.
Yeah. I mean, in the past, I've used NutriBio, Pure Bulk, Pure Encapsulations.
I'll link. Why don't I just link to these in the show notes? Just some good brands for the supplements mentioned. But again, I'm very cautious.
You still have to try them out. It's still necessary to try them out, because you can have a brand that's hypoallergenic, test it, how it gives you a certificate of analysis, whatever else, and then you eat it and then you feel terrible.
Well, I think there's still potential issues just on their own with having individual vitamins and minerals depending on their forms and depending on what other things you're eating them with.
That's true.
So I definitely prefer the food source. But yeah, we can link to the other ones.
Not a geek about it.
What's that? Yeah,
I would say the food source, especially if you're not a geek about it.
Right.
You can geek out. If you geek out on supplements, you know the combinations and the form and whatnot. You're right. Yeah. So, but if you don't, you can wind up causing yourself more harm than good.
Yeah, and even if you do, I think that people, it's very easy to fall into it's easy to run into issues when you're trying to supplement, and if you're trying to out supplement your diet, I would more look to, well, why aren't you getting your nutrients from your diet, which you should be able to typically get. Do you want to leave it there? Was there anything else you're thinking as far as testosterone goes?
The important thing that I think I don't think people want to necessarily optimize or like go for as high testosterone as possible. I think that's not necessarily a good goal. I think a good goal would be to like have an optimal testosterone and sort of try and inhibit estrogen and lower cortisol and things like that. I think it's not just about testosterone, because you can have a high testosterone and you could have it convert into estrogen and have a ton of issues with that too.
Yeah, that's a great point.
And I think the high testosterone is more specifically for males. I don't think as a female you want to have too high testosterone. It's usually associated with different diseases like PCOS and things like that, which is polycystic ovarian syndrome. That's a whole host in and of itself. So yeah, I think there's a sort of a combination of factors to keep in mind, and the things we touched upon should help with all of those factors. But it's just, yeah, a lot of people think, or a lot of guys think, that testosterone is the be all to end all, and I think that they'll find, if they experiment and try different things, that it's not necessarily testosterone. There's a bunch of different factors involved.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. And I think that also, if you're not testing your testosterone levels and you're just wanting to increase testosterone in general, you're probably more looking for certain effects like increased muscle mass,
Libido, confidence.
right? Things like that. And in that case, getting out of your own way, like getting the stress hormones lowered and things like that, is really more important.
Yeah. That's more, those effects are not necessarily like muscle mass is testosterone, but the other effects are more like dihydrotestosterone and dopamine. And optimizing those are all along the same pattern, which is the reason I mentioned the opiate effect of milk, is because generally people associate the testosterone with that drive and that like desire to do things and whatnot. But I think that's more of a dopamine effect. And for me, the milk had like an anti-dopamine effect, like it just chilled me out. So different people react to it differently, but I wanted to make that stipulation because of that specifically.
Sure. Yeah.
So.
Yeah, no, I think it's a good one. But yeah, so the basics we had mentioned: basic carbohydrate, fat, protein, ideally saturated fats, sugars over starches from fruit and fruit juice, getting enough protein, getting enough vitamins,
specifically, and not powders.
Yeah,
I think too.
Yeah, definitely. And which, as far as getting vitamins and minerals goes, you get a lot of those from those animal sources too.
Yeah, beef, seafood, lean chicken breast, if you like that. Lamb, things like that.
Yeah. Yep. And then make sure you're getting vitamins and minerals, which again should be covered with the solid diet. Psychological stress is a big one. Sleep, getting out in the sun, or getting vitamin D, and exercise.
Lifting weights is, I think, much better than running.
Yeah, I think so too. Unless the sprints are good. I think sprints are good rather than long distance running. And then the last thing that you had mentioned, reducing intestinal irritation and digestive irritation. Avoiding or reducing or avoiding grains, legumes, seeds, nuts, raw vegetables.
Which you should be avoiding anyway for like PUFA and other considerations by themselves.
Right. I mean, all of these are general considerations because, again, it's really a holistic system, and the things that increase the quote unquote good hormones, or the good things, are going to be the same, and the things that cause the bad things are the same too. So again, good and bad in quotes, but all right. Well, let's wrap up then. Is there anything else you want to share or mention, Mike?
No, I'm good.
Okay.
This is a long one.
This was a long one. We'll have to try to keep them shorter. Yeah. Let us know what you guys think. Thanks for listening, if you've listened this far. And make sure to subscribe wherever you're listening: YouTube, iTunes, Google Play. And send in any questions or reach out to me at jayfeldmanwellness.com, jay@jayfeldmanwellness.com. And you can also check out my website at jayfeldmanwellness.com, Facebook page, and Instagram. If you search Jay Feldman Wellness, you will find them. But yeah, I hope you guys are having a great day, and thanks for listening, and we'll talk to you guys soon.